Let's start there and see if we can work on down through the rest of chapter 5 or see how far we can get, and then there'll be a quiz later on. You are the salt of the earth, Matthew 5:13. But if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltness be restored? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trodden under the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hid, nor do men light a lamp and put it under a bushel, but on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. We said this morning that the essence of following Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount is inwardness, that you must be on the inside what God wants you to be, and that's true, but that doesn't mean it remains inside. So I think the presumption here probably is if you've got it inside, it's going to show on the outside. But it must show the right way and not the wrong way. So he says in verse 16 that the consequence of this kind of life that is described here is that it issues in good works, and people see those good works, and because of the particular character and because of the values and the lifestyle of the individual, it leads them to give glory to the Father who is in heaven. The other side of that we'll come to in chapter 6 verse 1, where Jesus says, do not do evil by them. So the sermon entertains two possible ways of allowing the externals of your life to be manifested, one good and one bad. If you look at verses 3 through 12, it could seem quite possibly that people like this are really not going to have much impact on the world. Today, in the business world, for the most part, you're not going to get very far if you're meek, and if you are merciful, and if you're poor in spirit. We are living in a world in which we talk about self-actualization, and there are good things about that and bad things about that, and in which we talk about being aggressive and dynamic, and sometimes to get ahead you've got to forget about other people and just push your own case. And here comes Jesus saying that's not the way you really get ahead. The way you really get ahead is by having other characteristics. So one might conclude, well, this is fine. You have a body of people, you know, who have their hands folded and holy looks on their faces and so on, but they're not going to have much impact on humanity. And Jesus says these people are going to have the most significant impact on humanity of any group. And so he uses a number of illustrations here in this paragraph. I'm not sure exactly how many. Salt, obviously, and the salt, as you know, has many uses. It gives flavor, it preserves. Even today, I understand in Arab countries, men take salt together to seal a covenant. It was sprinkled in little oil lamps. It makes the oil burn more brightly, and has other uses as well. I suppose the idea of seasoning is the one that's dominant here. Verse 14, you're driving away the darkness, similar to an image that we find other places. The idea would be, if that's the case, that the world, regardless of how it presents itself, is in darkness, and illumination comes from this humble band of people who are the followers of Jesus. Others argue the light of the world may be the same as the lamp on the lampstand in verse 15. It doesn't seem to me that it is. City set on a hill is a little bit different perspective, but it's saying you'll be seen, what will be seen. And then the last illustration, I think, to me shows that Jesus does have a sense of humor. At least I find it amusing, if no one else does, to think of someone coming into his house after a hard day of work as the sun is setting and trimming his little wick and his lamp and lighting it, and it puts a little light in the room as it's getting dark, and then just as carefully as he lighted the lamp, he takes some kind of cover and before. I think if a group of 8th graders had been peeking in the window of that house, which they shouldn't be doing, but if they had been and had seen what that guy was doing, they would have gone away giggling, saying, that guy has an elevator that doesn't go all the way to the top. He's playing with a deck of 51 cards. There's something missing here that ought to be here. Why in the world does he light the lamp if he's going to cover it up? I can imagine Jesus saying this with sort of a smile, tugging at the corner of his lips. How ridiculous it is for us not to be influential. We are the kind of people who are going to be influential. So he will instruct the world partly by words, but he will also instruct the world through people, living embodiments of what he has taught. When we are this way, we are making a statement. We are saying something. And when the world tries all the things it tries and finds out it doesn't work, sometimes they turn back to these people and say, you know, you people really do seem to have it together. I like to talk to people about conversion stories, and in the years that I taught at the University of Texas, only about 10% of my students were from Churches of Christ. Others were from other backgrounds, but they'd come by occasionally and talk, and we discussed conversion stories. How did you, and not necessarily that I would agree with what they believed ought to be involved in conversion, but we talk about it. And over and over again I heard the same story with different faces, but it's basically the same story, that there was a guy in the dorm, or a girl or someone, who in the midst of all of the other stuff in the dorm, which was about as far away from Christianity as you could imagine, who would read his Bible before he went to bed at night. And everyone laughed at him, but he'd go ahead and he'd read it. Or people would come by his dorm room and they'd see him kneeling by his bed praying. And while everyone else was sleeping off their hangovers on Sunday morning, he'd get up and go to Sunday school and church. And everyone gave him a hard time about it, but he just kept on doing it. And these kids who were converted would say, you know, I saw that guy or that girl, I saw all the stuff they took, and I saw how they kept on with their conviction and how together they were. And finally, when we get together, that's why I went to look. I saw someone that had what I didn't have, and I went and story a number of times from a number of people. When the thing finally falls apart on them, they want to find someone who's got it together. And Christians, I think Jesus is saying here, have it together. The next paragraph, words to the rest of the chapter. Think not that I have come to abolish the law and the prophets. I have come not to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, till heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot, will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Whoever then relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches men so shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. He who does them and teaches them shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, any of you who've been in a Bible class that has talked about this passage, and that's probably most of you, know that this is about a 2 Wednesday nighter. You know, at least a 2 Wednesday nighter, getting all the problems that come out of this, and I don't want to get into all those. But I think that Jesus is speaking to, and Matthew is writing to, people who may think, from what he's about to say, that he is abandoning the old system. And I don't care who you are or what you believe, when someone comes in with a new thing, the first question you're going to ask is, how does this relate to what we've already got here? Someone comes into the church where you are and they've got some wild new idea, the first thing you're going to say, well, but how does this square with what we've always believed? And so here comes Jesus saying, you have heard that it was said, but I say unto you. Well, it sounds like you're trying to do away with the law and the prophets. And so Jesus says, I'm not. And I think, looking at the overview, is that Jesus is saying, what God intended in the law and the prophets is now being brought to its completion. This is going. It's very important in the New Testament that many books in the New Testament show that Christianity is not a break from Judaism, it is the continuity of Judaism. Because in the first century you had this sense of antagonism between Christians and Jews, and so the Christian writers want to say, no, we are not a break from these people, we are the continuity. Our history and their history is the same. So Jesus is saying this. Not a bit will pass away from God's purposes until all is accomplished. And then in verse 19, he makes an argument against, are you ready for a big word? Antinomianism. These are people who believe you don't need to obey the law, whatever the law is. One of the emphases in the Gospel of Matthew is an emphasis on obedience. You obey the will of God. Because Jesus goes beyond the legal commandment to the heart and says it's not, some people might say, well then you don't believe in keeping rules. And Jesus is saying, no, that's not the case. Rules must be kept. Commandments must be kept. I'm not arguing for an abandonment of the commandments. I have known Christian people who thought they were so spiritual and understood so much better than the rest of us dumbheads that they felt, because they were on this elevated plane, this spiritual insight, that they were not amenable to the rather simple commandments of the New Testament. They're somehow beyond that. I think Jesus writes, but you are still responsible for specific commands as well. That's also important. On the other hand, he says in verse 20 that your righteousness must exceed that of the scribes and Pharisees. Now, there are different ways of looking at that. If you go over later in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus talks about the scribes and Pharisees, you remember, and does the woes and critical. You put it on the outside, but you don't have it on the inside. Maybe that's what he means here. Maybe he's saying that pretense thing, but it must be something more, leading us in verse 20 into what he's going to say later on. Now, that is a pretty quick brush over those verses, and I know may ignore some problems that are there, but I don't plan to spend any more time. I want to go on now to the next paragraph, which talks about murder. And notice the formula. You have heard that it was said to the men of old, you shall not kill. That's one of the 10 Commandments, as we all know. And whoever kills shall be liable to judgment. There is no Old Testament text that says that, although there are certainly plenty of Old Testament texts which are in the spirit of that, particularly in the Psalms. Psalm 137, verse 9, blessed will he be who takes the little ones and dashes their heads against the stones. I think I told you last year the Scotch metrical version of that. Happy will that trooper be who, riding on his naggy, will take thy wee bairns by the tays and ding them on the craggy, which sounds a lot better than the other. I thought that'd get a better response than it does, but it's two in the afternoon. But this is what the Jews believed. Whoever you shall not kill. Whoever kills shall be liable to judgment. They did have this attitude, and that probably would be better down with the enemies part in the later part of the paragraph or the chapter. I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother shall be liable to the council. Whoever says, you fool, shall be liable to the hell of fire. Now, that's the basic contrast. In this case, he will go beyond that. I don't know if this is significant or not, but notice what it says here. It says the old teaching was murder makes you liable to judgment. Murder, judgment. Judgment probably is the local court. Now, Jesus gives 3 things that lead up to murder, and they are in increasing degrees of intensity. First of all, he talks about anger, and the idea here is anger that you retain. It's not the kind of flare-up that you have playing ball, but it's retained anger. That's the least of the 3. That, he says, makes you liable to judgment. So maybe he's saying that's as serious, in a way, as murder, because murder begins there. Murder begins in the mind. Murder begins with hatred. The next step from that, then, he says, is when you insult someone or say reka to someone, which the footnote says, as we know, is an obscure term of abuse. And that makes you liable to the council. So you're moving up from the local judgment court to the Sanhedrin council, which would imply it's even more serious. Then if you say you fool, that makes you liable to the hell of fire, which is more serious yet. Why do you kill? You kill because you hate. And so Jesus is saying the problem is not solved by the avoidance of murder. The problem is solved by the avoidance of hate. And if you allow hate to be there, hate will lead to insult. If you allow that to go unchecked, insult will lead to saying you fool, which is nearly as strong there as it was in the original. You fool, you absolute slime, you scumbag. Think of all those terms you can think of that I can repeat in church. All those nasty things you can say about somebody else, and that's what the word implied. Back in the 1st century, you are as nasty, dirty, filthy, reprehensible, disgusting a human being as ever lived on the face of the earth. That's what the idea is. Now, you've already assassinated their character. If you want to do something worse, just go ahead and take their life. So Jesus says, it's not just murder, it's not just character assassination, it's not just insulting, it's even anger, hating. That's where you deal with the problem. That's the kind of person you are. That's the negative side. If you want to get the positive side of it, turn it around, then you look later in the chapter where he talks about love. If you don't want to have the wrong kind of anger, then you do have the right kind of love. The English word fool just doesn't get it, folks. You have different words for fool in Aramaic and in Hebrew. The worst word in Hebrew is Nabal. You know that guy wasn't named Nabal by his parents in the Old Testament. Would you name your kid stupid? Would you name your little sweet daughter Moronica? This is my daughter, Moronica. No way. No way. So Nabal wasn't that guy's name. I'm sure it wasn't. His name was Joe or Henry or something else. But when the Old Testament tells the story, it gives him a name that describes the kind of person he is. He is a real Nabal. Now, you can try that in the 8th grade if you want. Now, say something to your buddy. You are a real Nabal. You know that? No one will know what you're talking about. And probably shouldn't, because Jesus said not to do it, if that's what he had in mind. Using the word fool. I will not say fool, because Jesus said don't say you fool. Failing to understand that the English word fool is pretty pale compared to the meaning of the term that Jesus used. If you want to say the word, that's fine. But understand that Jesus did not speak English. Jesus spoke Aramaic, and even here we have a translation of it into Greek. But that's not the end of it. Here he adds something else. A double illustration beginning in verse 23. If you're offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar, go, first be reconciled to your brother, then come and offer your gift. You won't get right with God, because that's why you bring a gift, until you get right with the brother. Now, get the point. You're the one that's done wrong. And I guess the wrong that you've done is hatred, or one of these things he's talked about, character assassination, abuse, and you come to the altar and you want to get right with God, but you've really done this person. Stop right there. Leave coming in Sunday morning for communion. Now, I don't think it's really a parallel. But on the other hand, maybe it wouldn't be too bad an idea when you get up on Sunday morning and you remember that you've done something wrong to somebody, just to get on the phone or write a letter or something and say, I was going to church. And I thought, why am I going to church without having made right this wrong I've done to you? Please forgive me. Second illustration, verse 20, whatever that is, some of us can't see as well as we used to. Make friends, 25, quickly, with your accuser while you are going with him to court, lest your accuser hand you over to the judge to the guard, you be put into prison. Truly I say to you, you will never get out till you have paid the last penny, which I think is the idea you'll never get out. Prison back there to earn money. I think you're going to be in the pokey from that point on. So you're going to court with this guy, right? And again in the context of anger and all of that. And I suppose it's a parable of going to the final judgment. And maybe the judge is God. And when you get there, there's no question. It's not going to be a big argument about, whether you're voted in or out. You're out. The judge says to the guard and into jail. You got a choice. You can either make friends with your accuser, which means you go to your accuser and make it right, or you can stay in there till you pay the last penny. Starts with make friends quickly. It ends, it says you will not get out till you pay the last penny. Now, you can do whichever you want. That's your choice. Make friends or stay there till you pay the last penny. I don't like either one of those options. I'm sorry, those are the only ones you have. There's no C. It's A or B, whichever one you choose. Now we come to the X-rated stuff on adultery. Usually my students, my freshmen, perk up their ears at that. You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out and throw it away. It is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body be thrown into hell. If your right hand causes you to sin, cut it out, cut it off, throw it away. It is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body go into hell. Huh? Did you hear that? I wasn't listening too closely. I'm not sure I got that. I thought he said, pluck out your eye and cut off your hand, but I know he wouldn't have said that. I must have misheard. What did you hear? Well, I heard, pluck out your eye and cut off your hand. Well, that's radical. I mean, surely not. What does he mean by that? Is Jesus arguing for mutilation? You shall not commit adultery was part of the Ten Commandments, again, the second of the Ten Commandments. I say to you that the problem is far deeper than the commission of a sexual act with a person who is married to someone else or to whom you are not married. Adultery normally is referring to someone who is married, engaged in illicit sexuality. And Jesus says the problem is the lustful look or lust in the heart. That the act of adultery happens because we have previously had the thoughts of adultery. Now, I don't know how much out here in churches you have lessons on sexuality. But I know that last year in a Wednesday night class we discussed matters of this sort, and I said to the young people in the class, how many of you have heard this discussed in church? And only like 5% of them raised their hands. Wow, are we ever in trouble if we can't talk about this kind of thing? So here's a man who's 45 years old. He's never been unfaithful to his wife. And he comes home and says, I'm going to divorce you and I'm going to marry my secretary. Or I'm in love with my secretary. We've been having an affair. He'd never had anything prior to that time. Here's the preacher who says to his wife, this counselee and I have unfortunately fallen into bed together and we're deeply in love with each other. Happen? Now, why does a man who's 45, and it can happen to a woman too, I have to talk about men because I understand, I think, the male psyche a little better. Why does a man do that? Sometimes they're elders in the church. Sometimes they're preachers, deacons. He's never been unfaithful. Why does a man do that? Well, one reason he does it is because all those years he wasn't unfaithful, he was thinking about being unfaithful. And he was fantasizing all those years. And somehow, at a certain point in life, in this midlife crisis jazz, something slipped. He let something go. And what he never did before, but always thought about, now goes from thought to action. If he hadn't been watering those thoughts all that time, but had been working to control those thoughts, which he thought were so innocent, he might not be where he is now. I held a retreat back last spring. I called the preacher 2 or 3 days before the retreat because I hadn't heard from him, and he said, well, we've been pretty busy here, but here are the details. I went over. I found out when I got there that previous Wednesday evening he had gotten up before the congregation and spent 20 minutes apologizing to them for the fact he'd been having an affair with a woman who lived in the town where he'd previously been the preacher, and he had come within an ace of leaving his family and going to that town, but he decided not to. And so he got up and for 20 minutes that Wednesday night told the congregation, the elders said, we're behind you, we're going to help you with this. I talked to him some that weekend. I said, can you get her out of your mind? He said, I don't know. A few weeks later, I saw an elder from that church. I said, how is he? They said, well, last Tuesday morning, or whatever day it was, he was out of here, on the plane, and on the ground in the place where this other woman lived, 3 or 4 hours away by plane, before we even knew he was gone. Having left a note for his wife, and having left a note for the church, abandoned his wife, abandoned his ministry, abandoned his 4 kids, to go off and live with this woman. Why does that happen? Partly because we thought about it. We occasionally have problems where I teach, as you do other places, with date rape. And that's becoming an increasing problem. Date rape. Guys that girls know rape them on a date. And I tell the girls, look, if you're going out with a guy who spends a good part of his time drooling over the pictures in Penthouse and watching porno videos, if you go out with a guy like that, you better be prepared for the possibility that he's going to come after you. And you may be a victim of date rape. Because that's what he's thinking about. That's what's in his head. He's feeding that kind of fantasy. And it may come out in action. And you may come out being a victim. So, you know, as David Rubin says, the largest and most effective sexual organ is, pause for effect, everyone gasps, the brain. The brain. And if it wasn't hard enough to control our thoughts in this regard already, it is made increasingly difficult by our culture, which understands that you can sell toothpaste or beer or prunes, I guess. Anything you want to sell by creating the image that you will be sexier, and that if you're a man, beautiful women will be attracted to you, or if you're a woman, handsome men will be attracted to you if you eat the right kind of prunes or use the right kind of toothpaste. So it makes it difficult for young people in particular who are just awakening to these fires that burn within. I didn't ask for this, but here I do, and how do I control it? And I just want so badly to express myself in this way, and then all this stuff comes at them from the culture. So Jesus said, if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out and throw it away. If your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. Jesus is given to extravagant illustration. And of course, he does not mean literally to do that, because you pluck out your right eye and you still have problems with your left eye unless you're really nearsighted. So I think what he's saying is this. This is the problem of the mind. And we've got to get rid of something. And the thing we've got to get rid of is the kind of fantasizing, the kind of thinking that's going to lead us into trouble. And if you don't know it already, I will tell you, so you will know it, that getting rid of those kinds of thoughts is a major job. Because they are so delightful to entertain. And after all, they're only here in my mind. See, no one sees them. They're just here in my head. No one knows. And I just like to think about what it would be like if. And so you entertain those fantasies. And what Jesus is saying to us, if I don't miss him, is part of the problem of being God's man or God's woman is that you're concerned about getting those things out of your head. I know it's delicious, and it's really great to fantasize about it and so forth and so on, but I'm in a new place, I'm in a new sphere, I've committed myself to be God's person, and I'm saying to you, thoughts, scat. I'm not going to keep you around. Because people who commit adultery because they're thinking about committing adultery. All of us know how difficult this one is. Usually at this point I ask my students if they have any questions, and they generally have some if they're not too embarrassed to ask them. But we go on to divorce, and I will not ask for questions about this because I have not memorized the 19 Brotherhood views on this issue. It was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of unchastity, makes her an adulteress. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. This is based on Deuteronomy 24:1. Finds in her, and there are different translations of this, some unseemly thing is the way one translation has it, finds in her some unseemly thing. Now what in the world is that? Then he writes the certificate of divorce and gives it to her, and she is divorced in disgrace. Says, no, that's not the way it's going to be from now on. It's not that you give her a certificate and divorce her in disgrace, because when you do that, except on the ground of unchastity, which changes adulteress, and whoever marries her commits adultery. And personally, I could be entirely wrong about this, I think the reason Jesus uses the idea of adultery here is because that was an abomination to the Jews, and he wants to make the point as strong as he possibly can, so he connects it to adultery. not to develop some doctrine of continuing in adultery and so forth and so on, but we have different views about that. And the problem is that since the Jews, the Old Testament doesn't tell the Jews what an unseemly thing is, you've got to figure out what it means, so the rabbis worked on that one. What does it mean that she's done an unseemly thing, and he can divorce her for that? School of Shammai, which was a law that you can divorce her for. So I'm saying this because now you can sort of see what Jesus is up against. It is an unseemly thing, they said, if she puts too much salt in your food. So a woman put too much salt in your food, and she may end up out in the street. Now listen, there are no child payments or alimony back in those days. She's out. She may have turned to prostitution to live. It is an unseemly thing if the woman goes out, another view said, with her head uncovered in public. Or it is an unseemly thing if she talks to a man in the streets. Or it is an unseemly thing if she is a brawling woman. Now, what's a brawling woman? Well, another rabbi said she's a brawling woman if she yells loud enough they can hear it in the next house. So, if you want to nag, keep it down, you see. And you can divorce her for that. According to one school, in fact, one really liberal school of thought, the school of Akiba, said it's an unseemly thing if another woman is more attractive. So here, apparently, if these traditions are correct, here is a view, at least held by some people, they're just kind of shucking off wives for any reason at all. And so what Jesus is saying is no divorce. Now, he has one exception here, but basically he's saying no divorce. This is not a passage given by Jesus to figure out all the pretzel knots that we get after people have been married and divorced 4 different times. It is a pro-marriage, pro-woman passage. Jesus is saying you commit yourself to this relationship. I think that's what's involved here. You don't put her away for all these ridiculous reasons. You commit yourself to this relationship. In other words, Jesus is talking about the front end of the problem, not the back end. You see, and what we've done is we've come around here to the back end because we got all these convoluted problems, and we try to figure out what it says about the back end when that isn't what Jesus is talking about. Well, you say, what are the answers to the other kinds of problems? Well, I don't know that anyone would buy my answers, but I do think there are more things to consider than just divorce and remarriage passages. You got to consider the nature of repentance. You got to consider the nature of the mercy of God. There are a lot of things you have to take into account. And I think we also have to understand that just as people are not keeping the no lust commandment perfectly, people may not keep this one perfectly either. And if we expect mercy there, maybe there's going to be some mercy here. And in the long run, people who've got messed up marriages answer to God anyway. And all we can do, you see, is try to put them in a position where when they answer to God, they'll be able, you know, to give the right answers. That's not a very good way of putting it. But they can come before God, covered by the blood of Jesus. And when we've done all we can to help them be in that position, then what else can we do? They make their own decisions. They live their own lives. It just doesn't seem right to me that because a person feels justified in cutting them off from all the rest of Christian activity. Why not let them in on all the rest of this, hoping that if there's something they need to straighten out here, maybe the impact of all the rest of this will help them get that straightened out. Well, maybe I'm wrong about all that. The next one is swearing. Again, you've heard it was said to the men of old, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform to the Lord what you've sworn. But I say to you, do not swear at all. Either by heaven, it is the throne of God, or by the earth, it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, it is the city of the great king. And do not swear by your head. You cannot make one hair white or black. Let what you say be simply yes or no. Anything more than this comes from evil. Old Testament texts here, Leviticus 19:12, Numbers chapter 30, verse 2, Deuteronomy 23:21, probably refers to the taking of an oath, be relied upon, may have to do with some kind of promise, some kind of vow. And what we read in the commentaries is that apparently some people in that day would take vows they didn't intend to keep. And if those commentaries are right, and sometimes hard to tell, they believe that if you took a vow that involved the name of God, you better keep it. But if you took a vow that didn't involve the name of God, then you could play fast and loose enough if they're going to get a vow to insist that God's name is in there somewhere. But if that's the case, Jesus has said you can't take any kind of a vow or an oath to guarantee that what you said you'll be true to that doesn't involve God. Because everything connects to God. Heaven, earth, Jerusalem, your head, everything connects to God. Don't fool yourself in thinking you can take a vow that doesn't involve God. Your mother-in-law, your daddy's toupee, whatever it is, it all involves God. God's tied into it somehow. You never get separated from God in your vows. So what Jesus is saying is, don't swear at all. Guarantee that you will tell the truth doesn't really have anything to you on my best pair of shoes that I will do this. Absolutely, you can count on me. I guarantee it. Jesus is saying it doesn't depend on words you say. It depends on what you are. The guarantee that a Christian will be honest is the fact that Christ is formed within them. And I can take an oath by everything you can imagine. You can just listen to these, and it will not make me come any closer to telling the truth than I will because I'm a Christian. And that's, I think, why Jesus says yes or no. The guarantee is your character, the kind of person you've decided to be. And if you get a person who calls himself a Christian or herself a Christian who is not going to keep their word, you can get them to swear oaths from now on because it's not inside. Truthfulness, honesty, integrity are inside. And that's why it's so frustrating when you find Christian people with whom you do business who end up being just as unscrupulous as people who've never known the Lord. As if somehow you compartmentalize. And over here is my Christianity, and over here is my business, and you've got two separate sets of rules. Now, back years ago in Eugene, when they first heard it, you know, the thing that always comes up is, what about going into court and swearing on a Bible? That was the main application I heard. Let me tell you, if you don't want to swear on a Bible, don't do it. If you want to swear in a Bible, do it. That's my opinion. But that has nothing to do with whether you're going to tell the truth. I can go up there, if I'm a Christian, on the witness stand, and whether, because that's who I am. That's the thing to say, I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. That's like a difference between Tweedledum and Tweedledee. You know, 6 of one and half dozen. Maybe there's a difference there, but it seems to me that's kind of a, you know, just a way of obeying without obeying or something. I don't know. Christians tell the truth. Anything more than this comes from evil. All oaths involve God. Next we get into the retaliation. I may get into it and then stop and then finish it up tomorrow. Then we'll get on into chapter 6. You've heard that it was said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. I say to you, do not resist one who's evil. Does that mean if a thief breaks into your house, you just say, hey, the money's over here in this drawer, take it? If anyone strikes your coat, let him have your cloak as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to him who begs from you. Do not refuse him who would borrow from you. Deuteronomy 19:21, Leviticus 24:20, for its day, that was retaliation. They might go to the extent of a life for an eye. And so the Old Testament said, no, you can't do any more than in kind. But Jesus says the mercy that we find in that law, we're going to extend all the way now, and you do. Now, if you want to turn the other cheek as a literal absolute law, that's all right. I think it's an illustration. I think one has the option of turning and running, as well as turning the other cheek, but that you decide for yourself. But turning the other cheek is retaliation that involves your body. A person who would sue you and take your coat involves your property. A person who would force you to go 1 mile involves your time and your energy. A person who would beg from you involves your funds. So with regard to an affront on your body, with regard to your property, with regard to your time and your energy, with regard to your funds, you do not retaliate, which is tough. I would make a distinction, I want this to be clear, between personal vengeance and retaliation, which I believe Jesus is here condemning, and the seeking of justice, which is not retaliation. And I'm convinced that Christians have not only the right, but the obligation to seek justice in a retaliatory spirit, rather in a spirit of love. I think it's Reinhold Niebuhr tells the story about the newsboy in Detroit, and he sells his papers, and the thug comes and takes all the money away. You just let that go? Or do you seek justice to try to resolve that situation, you see? I think it's the time, isn't it? So I think the 8th graders have to go.